So when you're valuing single-family residences, you compare it to sales, right? Market
Yes.
data. What kind of market data do you compare them with?
If we're valuing a single-family residential property, we're going to look for comparable properties within its neighborhood that are also single-family residential properties. We're not going to compare a single-family residential property with a duplex or a triplex or a fourplex. We're going to look for similar properties and similar in characteristics for comparable sales.
Okay. And I think one of the questions was if you have a single-family home on a property and its zoning changes, the zoning changes, but it's still being used as a single-family residence, what comp sets do you use then? How do you value that property?
Well, by law, if it's a single-family residence used as a residence and has the protection of a homestead exemption, we must always consider that the highest and best use is as a single-family residence. So we will always compare that to other single-family residences, even though the underlying zoning underneath it may be something different.
Okay. So one of the questions that we had was if a neighbor builds a duplex or an ADU on their property, will that increase the valuation of my property?
The neighbor's property who adds the additional unit, particularly an ADU, because when they add the ADU, the still primary use of that property is still single-family residential. They'll get additional value added to their property because they have additional building. The square footage is larger. We're going to increase the value of that specific property, but at this point we have not seen any evidence that the addition of an ADU impacts the land values or anything else that would be contributory that would go across any of its neighbors. So right now the impact it has is only to the specific property that has added the additional unit.
Okay. And then one of the other questions that I've gotten, I think colleagues have gotten as well, that I posted was, if there's a vacant lot in my neighborhood and it goes up in value because of the additional number of units that could be put on it, or the fact that it could be used for a duplex or something else, if that vacant lot value goes up in value, will that raise the overall tax value of my single-family home in that neighborhood?
When we're looking at value, we're going to look at the overall total value, and we're going to compare that to properties that are similar. When we look at components, we're looking specifically at land. We're going to look for sales of other land components in that area that have similar characteristics. It may be that we change the allocation of our overall market value based on what we see in those land sales. We value land, either we look for vacant land sales, we look for properties where the improvement has been torn down, which makes it essentially a land sale, or we'll do an abstraction by allocation on improved sales. We will back out what we know the cost to reconstruct the improvement is, and the residual becomes land value. We may adjust our land value based on those sales of lots or tear downs, but when we look and determine the overall value of that property, we're still going to compare it to other similar properties. A single-family residential would be compared to a single-family residential. So the allocation between land and improvement might shift, but we will still be looking at others. So the improvement may go down, or if the land values go down, the improvement value might go up. That allocation might shift because of those sales that we see. But the overall market value of those properties is going to be determined by sales of other similar properties.
Of other single-family home properties.
Single-family properties.
Okay. Is a single-family property with a homestead exemption valued as a single-family residence, even if other uses or more units could be built on the property?
Yes. Particularly those that have the homestead exemption and get the protection. By law, we are required to consider that the highest and best use of that property is as a single-family residence and appraise it as such.
Okay. And would that be the same answer if that homestead residence is surrounded by other properties that have been given the ability to have more uses or additional uses?
Even if the housing or the use of the property surrounding it changes, we are still required by law to appraise that as a single-family residential. So it could be surrounded by businesses on all sides. It is still single-family residential, and we have to appraise it as single-family residential.
Okay.